wake up each day and go through the motions, fulfilling obligations and maintaining routines. But beneath the surface activity is persistent sense that you are drifting, that you are moving without direction, that you are living a life that does not feel like yours, that belongs to someone else or to no one at all. This is not depression exactly, though it can lead there. This is not failure. You may be succeeding by every external measure. This is feeling lost, is fundamental disorientation where you do not know what you want or who you are or why you are doing what you are doing. The feeling manifests as constant low-level anxiety about whether you are on the right path, combined with inability to identify what the right path would even be, as sense that everyone else seems to know where they are going, while you are pretending to have direction you do not actually feel, as exhaustion from maintaining the appearance of purposeful living, while internally experiencing only confusion and drift. You look at your life from outside and it seems fine. Seems like it should be satisfying, but from inside it feels hollow, feels like you are going through someone else's script rather than living authentically. The hidden truth about why you feel lost is not what most people think, is not about lacking clear goals or needing better planning or failing to find your passion. The hidden truth is darker and more fundamental, has to do with how you have constructed your life and your identity, with what you have been avoiding, with the ways you have betrayed yourself while believing you were being practical or responsible or realistic. Understanding why you feel lost requires examining what creates the feeling, what it reveals, and what it demands. You feel lost because you have been living according to scripts written by others, following paths that were expected or approved or safe, rather than paths that reflected your actual desires and values and sense of what would make your life meaningful. You chose the career that your parents valued, or that society rewards, or that seemed financially secure, not the one that genuinely engaged you or expressed what you actually cared about. You built relationships based on who you thought you should be with rather than on genuine connection and compatibility. You pursued goals that look impressive from outside without asking whether achieving them would actually satisfy you. This external orientation creates life that functions but does not feel authentic, that succeeds by conventional measures while failing to provide genuine sense of purpose or direction, that looks good from outside while feeling empty from inside. You have accomplished things, but they do not feel like your accomplishments because they were never your goals, were pursuits you adopted to meet external expectations rather than to express internal values. The feeling of being lost is therefore not about lacking direction, but is about following directions that were never actually yours, about reaching destinations that you never chose and discovering they do not feel like home, about succeeding at someone else's definition of success, while failing to build life that reflects who you actually are and what you actually value. The disorientation comes from the gap between the life you are living and the life you would have chosen if you had the courage or the self-knowledge to choose differently. But recognizing this creates an impossible situation because you cannot easily abandon the life you have built. You cannot simply walk away from career and relationships and identity you have spent years constructing, cannot admit that you have been living inauthentically without facing that you have wasted precious time on paths that do not serve you. So you continue, you maintain the performance, you tell yourself that everyone feels this way sometimes, that the feeling will pass, that you just need to be more grateful or more disciplined or more focused on what you have rather than on what feels missing. But the feeling does not pass because it is not temporary mood but is signal. Is your psyche attempting to tell you that something fundamental is wrong, that you are living in ways that contradict who you actually are, that the path you are on leads nowhere you actually want to go? You feel lost because you have avoided making real choices, have drifted into situations and relationships and commitments without conscious decision, have let circumstances and other people's expectations determine your life, rather than taking responsibility for deliberately choosing what you want and who you want to be. Every unchosen situation, every default decision, every path of least resistance you followed, these accumulate into life that feels like it happened to you, rather than like something you actively created. This passivity creates the feeling of being lost, because you are lost, You are not steering your life, but are being carried by currents you never examined, are living reactively rather than deliberately, are allowing your life to be shaped by external forces rather than by internal choices. You cannot feel oriented when you have never chosen a direction, cannot feel purposeful when you have never committed to purposes, cannot feel like you know where you are going when you have never decided where you want to go. The avoidance of choice is usually driven by fear of choosing wrong, by perfectionism that prevents any decision that cannot be guaranteed to be optimal, by terror of committing to something and discovering it was mistake, by belief that keeping options open is safer than closing them through definitive choice. So you remain in analysis, in maybe, in waiting for clarity that never comes, because clarity comes through choosing rather than before choosing, because you learn what you want by trying things rather than by thinking about them endlessly without action. But this avoidance of choice is itself choice, is decision to drift rather than to direct, is commitment to remaining uncommitted, is selection of path even when you pretend you are not choosing. And the path you select through non-choice is always the path of least resistance, is always what is easiest or safest or most approved, is never what you would choose if you had courage to choose deliberately. The feeling of being lost is therefore partly accurate assessment of your situation. You are lost because you have never chosen destination, have never committed to direction, have never taken responsibility for actively creating life, rather than passively allowing life to be created by circumstances and expectations, and the momentum of decisions you made years ago without recognizing they were decisions that would determine your trajectory. You feel lost because you have disconnected from your actual desires in service of being acceptable or successful or practical, have suppressed what you genuinely want in favor of what you are supposed to want, have learned to not even know what you desire, because knowing would be painful when you have no intention of pursuing it. You have spent so long performing appropriate wants and exhibiting approved ambitions that you no longer have access to authentic desires, cannot distinguish between what you genuinely want and what you have been conditioned to believe you should want. This disconnection from desire creates the feeling of being lost, because without access to what you actually want, you have no internal compass, no way to evaluate whether paths will satisfy, no method for distinguishing between options except through external criteria of what is valued or rewarded by others. You make decisions based on what will gain approval or what seems objectively best, rather than on what would actually make you feel alive and engaged and like you are living your own life. The suppression of desire usually begins early, starts with learning that certain wants are unacceptable or impractical or selfish, continues through adolescence when you learn to perform desires that gain approval while hiding actual desires that might lead to rejection or disappointment. By adulthood, the suppression is so complete that you genuinely do not know what you want, experience only vague dissatisfaction and sense that something is missing without being able to identify what. Reconnecting with authentic desire is therefore not a simple matter of asking yourself what you want, because that question produces only the approved answers you have learned to give, produces only the ones that are acceptable rather than the ones that are real. The authentic desires are buried beneath layers of conditioning and fear and self-protection, require patient excavation rather than simple introspection, emerge gradually through paying attention to what actually engages you rather than what you think should engage you. But even when authentic desires begin to emerge, they often create new problems because they contradict the life you have built, reveal that what you actually want is incompatible with what you have chosen, show that living authentically would require dismantling structures you have spent years constructing and facing, that you built your life on foundations that do not serve who you actually are. You feel lost because you are living in the gap between who you are and who you perform being, between authentic self and adapted self, between the person you would be if you had courage and the person you have become through accommodation and self-protection and fear of rejection. This gap creates constant internal tension, requires ongoing energy to maintain the performance, makes you feel like you are pretending even when you are succeeding, makes accomplishments feel hollow because they belong to the performed self rather than to the authentic self that remains hidden and unexpressed. The adapted self was created to survive, to gain approval, to avoid rejection, to fit into structures that had no space for who you actually were. This adaptation was necessary when you were young and actually dependent on others' approval for survival, was legitimate strategy when you had no power to create conditions that would accept your authentic self. But the adaptation that was necessary becomes prison when it persists into adulthood, when you continue performing even though you now have resources to live differently, when you remain in character long after the play has ended. The feeling of being lost is the authentic self trying to signal that it exists, that it has needs and desires that the adapted self ignores, that the performance is costing more than it provides, that you are living inauthentically in ways that create suffering you cannot name, because naming it would require acknowledging the split between who you are and who you appear to be. The disorientation is your psyche's way of saying that you are oriented toward wrong things, that you are following compass that points toward approval rather than toward authenticity, that you need to find different way of navigating. But closing the gap requires risk that feels unbearable. The risk of being rejected for who you actually are. The risk of discovering that your authentic self is less impressive or less capable than your adapted self. The risk of losing relationships and positions that depend on maintaining the performance. The risk of finding out that you do not actually know who you are beneath the adaptations, because you have been performing for so long that the authentic self has atrophied or never fully developed. You feel lost because you have built your identity on achievements and roles and external validations rather than on internal sense of self. Have defined yourself by what you do and what you have accomplished rather than by who you are beneath the doing and accomplishing. This creates fragile identity that feels threatened whenever you are not achieving or whenever your role is questioned, creates constant need to prove yourself through continued accomplishment, makes you feel lost whenever you are between achievements, because without the doing, you do not know who you are. This achievement-based identity works until it does not, provides sense of direction and purpose, as long as you are succeeding and being recognized, but collapses when achievement stops being satisfying, or when you recognize that no amount of external success fills the internal emptiness, or when circumstances prevent continued achievement. You feel lost because your identity was never rooted in anything stable, was always dependent on external validation and continued performance, was never about developing actual self that exists independent of what you accomplish. The hidden truth is that you have been avoiding developing genuine identity, have substituted achievement for self-knowledge, have used constant doing to avoid having to be, have filled your life with accomplishments and activities and roles, so you never have to face the question of who you are when you are not performing any of these functions. The busyness and the striving and the accumulation of achievements, all of this is defense against the void you would face if you stop long enough to ask who you actually are beneath what you do. Feeling lost is therefore accurate recognition that you do not have stable center, that your identity is constructed from external elements rather than from internal foundation, that you have mistaken your resume for yourself and are discovering that they are not the same thing. The disorientation comes from beginning to recognize that all your achievements have not created actual self, that you have been building elaborate external structure while the internal foundation remains undeveloped. But developing genuine identity requires exactly what you have been avoiding, stopping the constant achieving, sitting with the discomfort of not doing, facing the void that emerges when you are not performing or producing, discovering who you are when all the external markers are stripped away. You feel lost because you have encountered the fundamental meaninglessness that exists beneath constructed meanings, have begun to see through the purposes and goals and values that once motivated you, have recognized that the significance you attributed to various pursuits was projection rather than discovery, was meaning you created rather than meaning you found. This existential recognition strips away the frameworks that previously provided direction, reveals that the paths you were following lead nowhere ultimately meaningful, exposes that you have been running after goals that do not actually matter when examined from perspective of mortality and cosmic insignificance. This is the most disturbing reason for feeling lost, because it suggests the problem is not that you are on wrong path, but that there is no right path. Not that you have chosen badly, but that all choices are ultimately arbitrary. Not that you lack direction, but that direction itself is fiction you must create, knowing it has no foundation beyond your own commitment to it. The feeling of being lost reflects accurate perception of groundlessness, of the absence of inherent meaning or purpose, of the void that exists when you look beneath the meanings humans construct to make existence tolerable. Most people never reach this recognition because they maintain the defenses that prevent it. They accept conventional meanings without examination. They commit to purposes provided by religion or ideology or culture without questioning their foundations. They stay busy enough that they never have time or psychological space to ask whether what they are doing actually matters. But once the recognition occurs, it cannot be unnoticed, cannot be defended against through returning to naive belief in purposes you now see as constructed. This creates a particular kind of lostness, where you cannot go back to the meanings that no longer convince you, but also cannot go forward, because you do not know how to create new meanings adequate to replace what was lost, cannot find purposes that feel genuine when you recognize they are self-created rather than discovered, cannot commit fully to goals when you understand they are arbitrary choices rather than responses to objective value. You are stuck between meanings you no longer believe and meanings you cannot create, between the comfortable illusions you have outgrown and the uncomfortable truths you cannot live with. You feel lost because you have encountered the fundamental meaninglessness that exists beneath constructed meanings, have begun to see through the purposes and goals and values that once motivated you, have recognized that the significance you attributed to various pursuits was projection rather than discovery, was meaning you created rather than meaning you found. This existential recognition strips away the frameworks that previously provided direction, reveals that the paths you were following lead nowhere ultimately meaningful, exposes that you have been running after goals that do not actually matter when examined from perspective of mortality and cosmic insignificance. This is the most disturbing reason for feeling lost, because it suggests the problem is not that you are on wrong path, but that there is no right path. Not that you have chosen badly, but that all choices are ultimately arbitrary. Not that you lack direction, but that direction itself is fiction. You must create, knowing it has no foundation beyond your own commitment to it. The feeling of being lost reflects accurate perception of groundlessness, of the absence of inherent meaning or purpose, of the void that exists when you look beneath the meanings humans construct to make existence tolerable. Most people never reach this recognition because they maintain the defenses that prevent it. They accept conventional meanings without examination. They commit to purposes provided by religion or ideology or culture without questioning their foundations. They stay busy enough that they never have time or psychological space to ask whether what they are doing actually matters. But once the recognition occurs, it cannot be unnoticed, cannot be defended against through returning to naive belief in purposes you now see as constructed. This creates a particular kind of lostness, where you cannot go back to the meanings that no longer convince you, but also cannot go forward because you do not know how to create new meanings adequate to replace what was lost, cannot find purposes that feel genuine when you recognize they are self-created rather than discovered, cannot commit fully to goals when you understand they are arbitrary choices rather than responses to objective value. You are stuck between meanings you no longer believe and meanings you cannot create, between the comfortable illusions you have outgrown and the uncomfortable truths you cannot live with.